Let me share my screen here and make sure that this comes up here. Let's see here. Can everyone see my first slide there? Maybe Colin, give me a thumbs up if it's showing.
Yeah.
Okay, good, excellent. So again, my presentation tonight is titled "The Cheap Postage Movement of the 1800s." Um, the scope and the agenda here is I want to give you an overview of letter rates in the United States from the early part of the 19th century to the present day. And I'm going to focus on that period in the 19th century, basically from about 1840 to 1885, when the cheap postage movement, which was this grassroots movement, was really at its peak power. And I'm going to try to make the point that we as collectors owe a great deal of gratitude to the cheap postage movement. It really created the environment for all the stamps that we collect from the 19th century all the way up to the 21st century here. I'm going to go through a number of covers that are in my collection to sort of help illustrate the storyline. Just so you know, I collect covers that have interesting stories. So sometimes the condition of the covers or the condition of the stamp may not be pristine, but I picked it up just because I enjoyed the story that the cover can tell. So to kind of take a step back to the early part of the 1800s, mailing a letter in the United States was a complex affair. You had to know, first off, how far your letter was going to travel. And then you had to decide how many sheets you wanted to mail to your correspondent on the other end. And if you were mailing a letter locally, it could cost you 6 cents, or if you were mailing at a great deal of distance, it'd be 25 cents. It'd be multiple of those amounts if you were mailing multiple pages. So when you look at folded letters from this period of time, you'll see people many times using every square inch that they could possibly use on a paper to get their message across. Now, this kind of structure of combining distance and rates and with the number of sheets really was mimicking the structure that existed in Great Britain. And actually, in Great Britain, the structure was even more complex than it was in the US. If you look on this chart here, back in the late 1700s, your postage rate depended not only on distance and the number of sheets you were sending, but whether you lived in England and Wales, if you lived in Scotland, you had another set of rates. And if you were sending a letter from London to Edinburgh, there was a separate rate for that. Now, those were all standardized and unified by the late 1830s in Great Britain. But as you can see from the right-hand side of this slide, you still had more than a dozen increments in terms of distance and rates, anywhere from 2 pence up to a shilling, and then a penny extra for each 100 miles of that. So as a result, a lot of the mail that you see from this era is business related because it was incredibly expensive to send a letter at that time. So this is an example of a folded letter from 1791 that was sent from London to Edinburgh. So it was assessed the 7 pence charge. And if you look at wages back at that point in time, that 7 pence, was somewhere between 20 and 25% of a wage for a laborer back then. And so if you were a person working, you had a choice of either buying a 4 pound loaf of bread or you could mail this letter. Those were your options back then. And the same was true in the United States. I'll just go through a set of covers from each of those five categories of rates that I showed on an earlier slide. But if you were mailing a letter to a community maybe 20 miles away or 60 miles away, you'd be paying 6 to 10 cents to send that particular letter. And for somebody, working day in and day out, that was 10 to 20% of their wages just to send a single piece of paper, 25 or 60 miles. It got even worse when you had longer distances. So 12 and a half cents, which was the next tier up, back in the 1830 had the equivalent of $4.25 of purchasing power in 2026. And so you're looking at people spending, considerable amount of their hard-earned money to send these two single page letters, little over 100 miles. And you could also think about what that could buy. So that could buy you 1 to 2 dozen eggs back then. And so that was a considerable amount of expense just to send a single letter out. The one letter I'll mention a little bit of detail on is the one on the right-hand side of this page here. This is one that was mailed from Green Bay, which at the time was part of the Wisconsin Territory, to Milwaukee, which was also a town in the Wisconsin Territory at the time in 1836. It was dated December 25th. And what's interesting about this particular letter, it was a business letter from between two land investors, one in obviously Milwaukee, one in Green Bay. But Mr. Cotton was complaining to Mr. Hathaway about the Wisconsin Territorial Assembly that had just completed business. And the big controversy was that at that assembly, the delegates decided to designate Madison as a territorial capital. And one of the people who supported that particular designation was Judge John Arndt, who happened to be the father-in-law of Cotton. And so Cotton was complaining about, here was a gentleman from the Green Bay area, very well known Wisconsin pioneer, and Judge Arndt, casting his vote to put the state capital or the territorial capital of Madison rather than in his hometown of Green Bay. So he was complaining about that quite strongly. If you look up at the next rate level, the 18 3/4 cents, and again, this all goes back to the use of the Spanish dollar. In 1837, you could buy 3 to 4 pounds of rice or beans with that particular money. And this is one of the few folded letters that I have in my collection that is actually a personal letter. And it's an incredibly moving story. The gentleman who wrote this letter had lost his wife about 6 months before he mailed this letter. He was writing to a dear friend of his late wife. And in this letter, he talks about how he was holding their infant daughter as she passed away in this bedroom. And it's an incredibly moving, poignant letter to read and sort of put yourself back in his situation in Boston in the late 1830s. And then when you go up to the next rate level, the 25 cent for a folded letter going more than 400 miles. I mean, the pioneers in Wisconsin paid dearly to communicate with folks back on the East Coast. The letter on the left on this page was sent from Green Bay, Michigan territory at that time. In 1826, it was a letter from a minister who had been recently sent to Green Bay to set up a church in that village, and he was writing back to his superior in Philadelphia, and ended up paying 25 cents to have that letter sent. 16 years later, Green Bay was part of Wisconsin territory by that time, and this letter was sent to John Jacob Astor, of course, the famous wealthy individual who made his money off the fur trade and then later in real estate. And this letter came from his agent in Green Bay, who was managing his fur trade business in that village on his behalf. Again, a 25 cent cost there. And this last example, again, was mailed in March of 1833 for 25 cents. And what I like about this particular folded letter is just the flair that the postal clerk made when he wrote down the paid 25 in manuscript, very bold, with this nice Michigan territory date stamp on the left-hand side of this. And again, this was what I would call a business letter. It was sent by an individual who was actually stationed at Fort Winnebago. And this was a Army captain who was writing back to this head of a religious organization in New York, requesting a minister be sent to tend to the needs of the soldiers on this particular base. So again, really fascinating letter, but just put yourself in the position of having to spend 6, 10, 12 and a half cents, 25 cents to send a letter that distance. So what ended up happening is that people complained about these rates very strongly. And this is just a couple of excerpts from newspapers at the time. The one on the left is from the Huron Reflector in Norwalk, Ohio. They were talking about in this particular article how if you were an individual who had 5 letters to send from Boston to New York, you could send those 5 letters, or you could get in a wagon and get transported up to Boston and deliver them yourself. They also talk about the fact that you could send a letter from Troy, Pennsylvania to New York or Boston for basically the same cost of sending an entire barrel of flour. And those two items, the letter and the barrel of flour, would probably travel on the very same convenience to get up there. On the right-hand side, and I'll get back to this guy, that this was a column written by a gentleman who signed it Beta, and he was actually Barnabas Bates, and I'll get back to who that was in just a second. But in this case, he's talking about how immigrants, that moved from the East Coast to the Midwest, were paying a half day's wage to get a little bit of news from their family but back east, or they had to pay, again, the equivalent of a half a bushel of wheat for every letter that they wanted to receive. So people were complaining a great deal about how high and expensive postage rates were at this point in time. The other thing that really incensed people was the free franking privileges. And free franks were really out of control in the 1840s. If you were an employee of the government, obviously the president, the vice president, members of Congress had free franking privileges. But they also went much deeper into the government, where you had postmasters and you had other employees of the federal government who could send letters free of cost anywhere in the country. Now, there were supposed to be rules around the use of free franks, but they were often violated. And the letter on the left-hand side of this page, you can consider this legitimate use of a free frank. It was sent by the Delavan, Wisconsin postmaster in 1845. He was responding to somebody from Ohio who was trying to track down a particular individual. And so the postmaster was helping this individual locate this client that he was looking for. On the right-hand side of this page is a letter that I would consider sort of iffy. It was a free frank sent by Senator Daniel Webster in 1840. He was sending it to a constituent, or I should say someone who was not one of his constituents, actually a friend of his in New York, trying to set up a casual business meeting with this individual. But Senator Webster's, free frank may or may not have been improper, but there certainly were many egregious cases where politicians, in some cases, were mailing their laundry home to be done with the free frank provision. And then you had also members of Congress sending their mail free frank outside of congressional sessions, which was illegal. So you had this combination of high rates, the government employees and government officials being able to send their letters free of charge, and it really was irking people. And to add insult to injury, as you might very well know, back in the 1830s and 1840s, it was pretty typical for the recipient to have to pay that postage and not the sender, because prepayment was not required. And this again was from a column that Mr. Barnabas Bates wrote, aka Beta. And this, I don't know if this story is true, but it really was moving, where he talks about this poor widow was sitting outside the post office in tears because she hadn't heard from her son in 11 years. And there was a letter in the post office waiting for her, but she had to pay 25 cents to get that particular missive. And she didn't have more than 6 cents to everything that she owned. And somebody took pity on her and gave her the 25 cents to get that letter out. But it was not unusual for postage to be, or for a letter to be sent and never claimed. Because people didn't want to pay the postage, or they simply understood that if they got a letter from a loved one and that letter arrived, they took that as an indication that the person was okay, and so they didn't bother paying for the letter. So there was a lot of unpaid postage, which was just adding to the postal service's costs. And then you had the private sector as well coming into play here. So they smelled an opportunity, and you had companies like Hale and Company, founded by James Hale in late 1843, and they figured out that they could undercut the post office department. And in this case, Hale, as you can see from the advertisement on the left-hand side, they would deliver a letter between any of the cities listed here for 6.25 cents. And if you bought a sheet of their stamps for $1, 20 stamps for $1, so a nickel a piece, you could have your letter sent for that amount. And the letter on this page is one which does have a Hale and Company stamp. So whoever sent this letter obviously purchased a sheet of stamps, 20 stamps for $1, and got this letter sent for a nickel instead of 18.75 cents. So by 1840, the post office department was really in financial jeopardy. You had high rates were curtailing volume. You had unclaimed mail adding to the post office department's expenses. You had private companies skimming the cream off the top, persistent government deficits, and you had the public just clamoring for reform because of what they felt were these abuses of the free franking privilege. So really what you needed in the United States at that time was a catalyst to really push this movement forward for reform. And that catalyst came from Great Britain, right? Sir Rowland Hill's 1837 paper, where he argued that the postal service in Great Britain needed to be reformed. He was advocating that prepayment be or postage be prepaid, and that would drop the cost of unclaimed mail dramatically. He argued that free franking should in fact be abolished and eliminated. And most significantly, he argued that a letter should be sent. Someone should be able to send a letter anywhere within Great Britain for the cost of 1 pence. And by 1840, his reforms were adopted, and it turns out that his projections came true. That mail volume soared, and the British postal system actually was on a much sounder financial footing after the reforms. Now, those changes led to two of the, I think, most desirable areas that collectors have, and that's the first adhesive postage stamp, the penny black, issued in 1840, in May of 1840, with its companion Mulready sheet, the Mulready letter sheet, which was much maligned and actually was dropped by the Postal Service there pretty early on after its issuance. But both of these missives were sent for the cost of 1 penny. And prior to the reform, the letter sheet on the left-hand side would have cost a shilling or 12 pence to send, and the one on the right-hand side would have cost 11 pence to send that. Just a real quick aside on this letter on the right-hand side. I picked this up a few years ago because I always wanted a penny black on a folded letter. So I picked this up and I was reading the letter, and it was sent to this gentleman. You can see on the front there, his name is John Hicksman, in London, and it was sent by a naturalist, a member of Parliament at a pottery manufacturer in Swansea. And I ended up figuring out that the guy in Swansea was writing to Hicksman about the death of somebody. And it turns out that Hicksman was a Navy prize agent, a very wealthy person who managed prize money for Navy captains. The sender was this guy named Lewis Dillon, who was a very well-known naturalist at the time. And they were writing about the passing of Frederick Hickey, a captain in the Royal Navy. Long story short, I managed to hook up with a descendant of John Hicksman in London. He and I kind of interpreted this letter, tracked down the other people in it. I wrote a story on this for Keller Stamp Collectors Quarterly a few years ago. And just about 6 months ago, Richard Hicksman, his descendant, reached out to me and named me an honorary member of the Hicksman family and invited me to a family reunion in Horsham, England this summer. So philately can have a lot of side benefits. So I'm looking forward to that trip. So with this reform in Great Britain, though, it really spurred the cheap postage movement in the United States. It was really the catalyst to set this movement afoot. And here's an excerpt from the United States Gazette newspaper in Philadelphia in July of 1838, picking up on the fact that the British Parliament was contemplating this reform to the English Post Office Department. And I highlighted it in this little snippet. They talk about reducing the postage in Great Britain to 1 penny, which was the equivalent of 2 cents in the United States. And so that became the mantra of the cheap postage movement, was to get a 2-cent letter rate in the United States, beginning in the late 1830s. And we had our own Rowland Hill in this country, a gentleman by the name of Barnum Spates. I mentioned his name earlier in the context of those couple of newspaper articles. He worked for 20 years to achieve the same thing that Rowland Hill was pushing for in Great Britain. That was for cheaper postage, and that was uniform across the country. That would be prepaid, and he wanted to eliminate all of the free franking provisions. I'm not going to go into detail here, but you'll note he was also an anti-slavery activist. And part of the debate that circled around the postage rates in the United States was between abolitionists and pro-slavery people. And you had pro-slavery advocates who did not want to see postage reduced in cost because they were concerned that it would create a flood of propaganda into the southern states. So you had pro-slavery people pushing for more expensive postage. And you had people like Barnum Bates and other abolitionists who were pushing for cheaper postage, in part to be able to get that propaganda down to the southern states. So that's a whole nother dimension of this that I'm not going to cover, but I thought I would just mention it here. And as you can see, if you go to Mount Auburn Cemetery in Boston, you can find Barnett Smith Bates' tombstone there. Right on his tombstone, it's engraved that he's the father of cheap postage. So Congress got the message finally, especially after the British reforms in 1840. And in fact, the first individual who introduced the legislation was Senator Daniel Webster. And he introduced legislation to reduce rates back in June of 1840, but it didn't go anywhere. What really forced Congress's hand to do something about the postage rates in the United States was the competition that the private carriers like Hale represented. And so they did take up a bill in the middle of 1844 to reduce letter rates, to basically 5 cents from 6 or 10 cents for over 100 miles. And the cheap postage advocates were having nothing to do with it. They just lambasted the Congress, said that they were trifling with the wishes of the people. And in early 1845, this movement just flooded Congress with letters and petitions and newspaper editorials, just clamoring for reducing rates to 2 cents and eliminating all franking privileges. And as they described, that they just felt it was something odious and entirely anti-Republican in the present system that forced people to pay for their letters, but not for members of the government. So in 1845, Congress got a bit more serious, and the Senate, really did take, I think, this commentary from the cheap postage movement to heart, and they passed a bill that would have reduced rates to 5 cents per half ounce, so basically 2.5 times as expensive as what the rates were in Great Britain, but that 5 cents per half ounce, regardless of distance, reflected the broader geography of the United States. And that bill would have eliminated all franking privileges. Now, at the time, the cheap postage advocates figured this was going to go nowhere because the House, not unlike today, was basically unable to get anything done. As the people talked about then, they seemed to care little, but for the annexation of Texas and the acquisition of Oregon. But the House even felt that the political pressure, particularly because of the competition from these private carriers. So they finally did pass an act in March of 1845 that reduced our postage to 5 cents for less than 300 miles, 10 cents for over 300, narrowed free franking privileges, but most significantly, they put the private letter carriers out of business. What was odd about that particular legislation in light of the reforms that took place in Great Britain, it did not provide the authority to the Post Office Department to print postage and did not make prepayment of postage mandatory. Now, why was postal reform opposed? I thought some of these reasons were kind of humorous in some ways. One is they were concerned the Post Office Department was going to lose money. Well, the fact of the matter is it was already was running in the red. And there were certain groups that were benefiting from the existing structure. I mean, certainly the mail contractors, the time, coach, rail, steamboat contractors, were getting wealthy from the way rates were set. Postmasters, by and large, liked it because they had the free franking privilege, but they also had their compensation tied to the postage rates that they had it. Publishers actually were being subsidized by the letter rates since they had lower rates. And of course, government officials wanted to keep the free franking system in place. The other thing which I find humorous, there was a lot of concern in Congress that if they made postage based on weight instead of page count, that Americans would then import French-made paper that was thinner and put all that stuff and send it out at a cheaper cost rather than using good old-fashioned American heavyweight paper. That sort of fell on deaf ears because by then you started to have envelopes being imported from France, which really made it imperative to base postage on weight because it was not reasonable to expect somebody to open up an envelope and count how many sheets of paper were in there. So one of the keys, of course, of this legislation is it did standardize rates. And so while it did not authorize the Post Office Department to print stamps, it did propel some local postmasters, most significantly Robert Morris in New York, to issue his own stamps. And this has led to a whole list of famous postmaster provisionals. The ad here on the left-hand side was from the New York Tribune shortly after Morris made these stamps available. And the letter on the left hand side or right hand side, I enjoyed. I picked this up. It's a postmaster provisional postmark in Boston and sent to New York. And one of the things Morris did after he issued these stamps in New York City in 1845, he also sent a supply to postmasters in some other cities that were expected to be sending letters into New York. So this is a nice example of one that was postmarked in Boston and sent to New York. Now, eventually, the U.S. Post Office Department got on the stick and did issue the first stamps, as we all know, in 1847. And these are nice examples from Wisconsin, early usages of the 1847 stamp. The one on the left-hand side has two copies of U.S. Scott 1, postmarked in Madison on July 9th. The year was probably 1850. Since the supply of these 5-cent stamps did not arrive in Madison until the latter part of 1849. Now, it's certainly possible that the sender brought the stamps into Madison, but I'm guessing it was probably sent around in 1850. And this is one of only 4 recorded examples of the 1847 issue from the town of Madison, Wisconsin. And on the right-hand side is the 10-cent issue, U.S. Scott 2, that was postmarked from Milwaukee in 1848 to New York with a nice Milwaukee blue hand stamp there. And this is one of only 4 known covers with the U.S. Scott 2 that were sent from the Wisconsin Territory. So 2 nice examples of these usages from the territory and state of Wisconsin. But the cheap postage advocates were not happy, even though rates came down to, significantly in 1845. The Post Office Department was operating in the black again. The cheap postage advocates figured out that really what Congress was after was not reducing postage, but they wanted to put the private carriers out of business. And so, soon after this bill was passed in 1845, the cheap postage advocates were back at it. And in 1850, this is just one snippet from the Buffalo Weekly Republic, where they were talking about we need 2-cent postage on a half ounce for any distance, and they did analysis that they provided in this article where they showed it covering all the expenses that the Post Office Department had. They made it very clear that they wanted to eliminate all franking privilege as well, to make sure everyone was paying for it. And that effort continued right up until the early 1880s. And this is an article from the Chattanooga Daily from 1882. It talks about a Congressman Hill of New Jersey who was instrumental in introducing to reduce that postage rate to 2 cents per half ounce. But between 1845 and 1885, there was just a consistent message from the chief postage advocates to get the letter rate down to 2 cents. That was their sole objective. And lo and behold, they got there. But unlike in Great Britain, where they got down to the lowest rate in 3 years, you figure Sir Rowland Hill came up with this proposal in 1837, and by 1840 it was in place. It took 40 years, a number of iterations, to get the U.S. postage rates down to the equivalent level of 2 cents or 1 penny for any distance traveled, and that finally came about in 1883. But there was a lot of fits and starts, between 1845 and 1883 to get there. And I'll just give you some examples of that. And I'm maybe being a little dramatic here, but the cheap postage movement, given what they did and their consistent push to get rates reduced, really created all sorts of collecting possibilities for us today. So just quickly on the left-hand side here, this is a cover from 1854. This was before prepayment was recovered, but after Congress put in some penalties if you didn't prepay postage. So here was an example of somebody who tried to slip a fast one past the postal clerk to have signed his letter free. The postal clerk caught it, ended up charging the receiver of this case, a recipient, 5 cents postage, which reflected the 3 cent charge for the distance at the time, plus a 2 cent collect fee. And finally, by 1856, of course, prepayment was required in the form of postage stamps. So these other 2 covers here were from what is really a fascinating period in in the U.S. Postage era between the 1851, 1857 perforate series, and then the same design that came out in perforated form in the late 1850s. These two stamps, are studied to no end by plate enthusiasts and plating. And you'll see these on obviously a lot of letters from the 1850s and early 1860s until the stamp shown on the lower cover there was demonetized. You'll notice here too that both these covers were carried by local carriers to the post office. So although the 1845 Act put private carriers out of business, they only put private carriers out of business who used the post roads between cities. But they did not affect private carriers that were carrying mail within cities. And so in Philadelphia at the time, there was an operation called Blood's Dispatch that carried letters locally in the city. And in this case, this was a letter from a hotel that was taken to the post office and then sent off. And likewise in New York, there was a Boyd's City Express that provided a similar service. Those were eventually put out of business, but at least in 1845 until the 1860s, they were still allowed to carry money within cities. So again, fascinating part to look at. Then in the later on in the 1860s, you had this period of time where the two covers on the top feature there was the Washington issue from the series of 1861. That stamp was used all the way through the late 1860s. You'll see these on a lot of Civil War covers. And then, of course, they were issued in grill form later in the 1860s. So you'll find hundreds and hundreds of covers with this particular stamp. And it was a venerated stamp, right? And what was fascinating to me is in the 1860s, people loved this stamp so much that when the Post Office Department issued the pictorial series that's shown in the lower left hand there with the locomotive things, stamp collectors in particular were just outraged at it. And they described this as a miserable, confused looking thing with wretched printing. And they just clamored to go back to the venerable state of our national heroes depicted, the George Washingtons and Thomas Jeffersons. So this pictorial series that we love to collect these days, and collectors, just fall over themselves to have a full set of these. It was just abhorred back in the late 1860s and went away. And the post office came out with this 3-cent stamp shown in the lower right-hand side of this slide. And about 6.5 billion of the stamp were issued between 1870 and 1883. In fact, when I was a kid collecting, I used to hate opening up a kilo of stamps and just finding hundreds of this what I thought was a stupid 3-cent stamp. I used to just like tear them up because I get so many of these stupid things. But they were issued in such huge quantities, you couldn't avoid them. And then, you got the free francs, right? So in 1873, the cheap postage movement did achieve a huge victory when they managed to finally get free francs eliminated. Short-lived victory, though, because by 1891, free francs were back in place for just about everybody, including the Congress and the administration. But there was a period there when government agencies actually had to be accountable to their expenses, and so you can find examples of these official stamps used on covers beginning in 1873, and like I say, petering out pretty soon thereafter. But when the cheap postage movement achieved its goal of the 2-cent postage in 1883, that just opened up a wonderland for collectors of postmarks and cancellations. And this is an example of 4 covers, but you can find so many differences among these covers with this particular 2-cent stamp. Again, about 4.5 billion of the stamp were issued in a narrow 4 to 5 year period. And this is a favorite hunting ground for people looking for print varieties and for cancellations. I mean, just on this page, you've got duplex hand cancels, where postal clerks had a single handheld device. One side had a die with the postmark date and year and time, and then the right hand side was a killer cancel. They could apply one hand stamp and kill it. Then you got a cover on the top that has the hand stamp postmark, but then you still got somebody using a fancy, cork cancel to cancel the stamp. And on the lower left-hand side, you've got somebody who's actually just did a manuscript cancellation of it with a nice little train mark there just to the left of the stamp. So just a tremendous variety that came about for us. And then as you look at the collecting possibilities for the remainder of the 2-cent stamp era, it's almost endless, right? I mean, the 2-cent stamp rate was in place from 1885 or 1883, I should say, for the half ounce, went to a full ounce in 1885. And that was in place until 1932. And if you think about the collecting possibilities, you've got first bureau issues, you've got the first commemoratives coming out, you've got machine cancels. I provide enough covers on here from Wisconsin for those of you that are online from that state. But yeah, I've got covers Hotel Pfister, Pabst Blue Ribbon, the 50th anniversary of the state, my high school alma mater, St. Francis Seminary in St. Francis, Wisconsin. So you had a long period of time, 47 years basically, with this 2-cent rate was in effect. And that finally came to an end on July 5th, 1932. And that cover in the middle was canceled on the last day of the 2-cent rate per ounce. So even though the cheap postage advocates, I'm sure, were crushed by the increase in rates from 2 to 3 cents, it certainly wasn't the end of the world. I mean, you had a period of time pretty much from 1885 to 1958 where letter rates were incredibly stable. From basically went from 2 cents in 1885, popped up during World War I up to 3 cents, back down to 2, and then all the way until 1958. We had a 3-cent rate in this country. And think about this: the cover that is pictured on this slide was postmarked in 1939 using a 3-cent American banknote stamp from 1879, so 60 years after it was issued, to pay the postage for this particular letter. That would be like taking that stamp pictured on the lower right-hand side here from 1966 and trying to mail a letter today, right? Which you'd be about 73 cents short in your cover there. But pretty remarkable stability for postage over that period of time. Now, there was one last hurrah that the cheap postage movement tried, and this was in the early 1900s, 1914 to be specific. There was an organization that popped up in Cleveland, Ohio. It was called the National 1-Cent Letter Postage Association, and they were active until the mid-1960s. And they had their biggest period of activity in the 19-teens and into the 1920s. But they tried to make the case that even though postage rates were 2 cents or 3 cents, the fact of the matter is that at least 1 cent of that postage was a tax that the post office department was using to subsidize other carries that they did, things like magazines and other publications. And they pushed for a number of years to get the national, or to get the letter rate down to 1 cent. And in fact, there was a letter that I found that was sent in 1940 where supposedly the post office would refuse to carry mail that had these labels. And that was just an assertion that somebody made, but I'd love to find evidence in the post office department's record that they actually basically blackballed any letters that had this label on there. So to kind of wrap up here, the cheap postage movement really was amazingly persistent. Again, it was a grassroots movement. Its intellectual leadership came from Barnabas Base, but it was really a grassroots organization that was persistent. I mean, it took 40 years to achieve their goal of a 2-cent letter rate. And I would say that we owe them a debt of gratitude and thanks, because it really created the conditions for this hobby to grow. They also deserve an incredible amount of credit for pushing the letter rate down, right? In the 19th century, the cost of sending a 1-ounce letter dropped by 96%. Right, it went from 50 cents for a 1-ounce or 2-sheet letter in the early 1900s, all the way down to 2 cents by the end of the 19th century, and that stability lasted all the way into the mid-20th century. But I think everyone today would say today's letter rates are just outrageous, right? I mean, who can spend 78 cents to send a letter? This is ridiculous. Well, I'm going to end this presentation with a few charts. And as I apologize here, I'm an economist by trade, so I can't help myself. But I do want to answer that question, are letter rates today, in fact, outrageous? Well, this chart gives you 200 years of letter rates, going back to 1825 up until 2025. And as you can see today at 78 cents or whatever it is exactly, in nominal dollars, postage rates today are the highest that they've ever been. In fact, in the last 10 years, there's been a single case where rates went down, but they've been pretty much steadily marching up since the late 1950s. But if you adjust letter rates for inflation, it tells a much different story, right? If you look at the cost in 2025 of mailing a letter back in the early 1800s, you'd be talking somewhere between 14 and $17 to mail a single letter. So on an inflation adjusted basis, you could argue that right now postage rates are as cheap as they've ever been. They are historically inexpensive based on inflation adjustments. And in fact, if you look at the increase in letter rates relative to the consumer price index, this is from 1913 up to 2025. If you look, the increase in postage rates has pretty much mirrored the overall increase in inflation, and it's only been in the last couple of years where postage rates have outpaced the rate of inflation. So, I would argue that today postage rates are historically cheap and inexpensive, and have largely maintained the relationship to the overall cost of living. However, while letter rates are now outrageous, right? Technology has completely changed how we communicate, and we all know that, right? We can communicate by Zoom. I don't have to send you a letter. I can call you up on a Zoom call. I can send you an email. I can text you, and that really is where the challenge is for postal service today. In fact, postage rates in the U.S. are not only inexpensive historically, but we probably have the least expensive postage rates of any country in the world. But the fact of the matter is that postal services really can't compete with the way we communicate today. And I think the case that we heard about in Denmark late last year, where they're going to stop delivering physical letters after 400 years, I think is pretty telling of where postal service might be going in the world in general. So with that, I'm going to conclude my presentation. Thank you for tolerating my 45 minutes of talking, and I'd be happy to take any questions and certainly any comments you have on anything that I missed or I overstated. So please have at it.
Okay, Mike, thank you very much. And I think thank you especially for personalizing the cheap postage movement to Wisconsin and actually bringing in so many Wisconsin examples. I mean, that really, I think for those from Milwaukee and Wisconsin has sort of personalized it to their own area of interest.
Well, thank you. That really reflects my own, because I grew up in Wisconsin, so it's got a special place in my heart.
Well, as does England now, as Mr. Wilson Hicksman.
That's right. That's right. I'm looking forward to that.
Hyphenated.
That's right.
So anyway, if any of you have questions or comments for Mike, if you'd like to unmute yourself and share your comments with us.
Well, Mike, this is Mary Ann. I thought it was an excellent presentation, fascinating, and it was interesting to me, the insight that you brought into this time period. Like Colin, I also love the Wisconsin connection. And I wanted to know, Mike, whether you would like to give our people here, while they're still listening to us, a little introduction to the talk that you're personally giving at Milcopex.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Mary Ann. Yeah, I'm going to give a talk which is called The Golden Age of Flight and a Postal Thief. I came upon a set of covers a couple years ago from a Rasdale auction, all airmail covers, and it took me a while to figure out what the story was behind it. But they were a set of covers sent to a young boy and his sister in the late 1920s, early 1930s. By their uncle, who was an assistant postmaster in Milwaukee, and by his boss. Fascinating set of covers going all the way from experimental air flights in Milwaukee in the 19 teens, but a lot of it through the whole golden age of flight. Lindbergh carried covers, Graf Zeppelin mail, contract air mail, you name it. It was a fascinating set of covers, but they all abruptly stopped in the early 1930s. And just to give you just a hint of what happened, it had to do with the assistant postmaster was their uncle was pilfering money out of the mails. and ended up serving a long term at Leavenworth. So it's a fascinating story. Some really cool coverage from the city, and it really gives a good example of airmail carriers back at that point in time. So yeah, it'll be fun.
I have a question, Jim Barnett here.
Yes, sir.
You started with a discussion of what was going on in Great Britain, and I wonder if you could compare the U.S. experience with Great Britain's experience and how much they suppress their cost of their mail, and maybe throw in Canada as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. I don't really know much about the postal history in Canada, but I will say in Great Britain, excuse me, after they uh, took their postal reforms in 1840, postal volumes soared at that point in time. The cost that they had of unclaimed mail dropped obviously to nothing because at that point all the postage had to be prepaid, and the post office operated in the black. And so they were incredibly successful with their postal reform of 1840. I think one reason why the United States kind of lagged in terms of adopting all the changes that Great Britain made at one time was the fact that Great Britain was a much smaller geographic area. So the feeling was that they could probably make it work with a penny postage anywhere within Great Britain, but given the geographical expanse of the United States, they couldn't quite make the same thing work here. The one thing that I haven't looked into that I need to, though, is to see to what extent the government subsidized the post office departments in each countries after that. I mean, certainly in the United States there was some subsidy being provided by the federal government to the post office. I don't know if that same thing happened in Great Britain. So that'd be the other part of the story to tell. I was just focusing on the role of the cheap postage movement to get that 2 cent rate in place. But I think again that the subsequent support from the governments, whether it be in Great Britain or the United States, is something that I should look into.
Did the British keep their rates low until the Depression, like we did?
They did, yeah. I think the 1 penny rate stayed in place into the 20th century. I don't know if anybody on the call knows for sure, but I'm pretty sure that was the case.
Well, I think, Mike, the the one thing which you didn't mention, but is I think relevant at this point, is of course that no matter what was happening domestically, you correspondingly had the urge for cheap postage internationally as well. And if you look at how the rates changed transatlantic, and going back to the question about Great Britain, you of course had the imperial penny postage rate, the uniform penny rate within the British Empire,
Yeah.
which came in late 19th century. Do you want to say a little bit about the international side of this, Mike?
Yeah, the one thing that I do know, I mean, certainly you did have, especially between the United States and say Germany, you had a number of postal arrangements made, bilateral arrangements between various countries. And I think one of the things that the cheap postage movement impact that had internationally was the Universal Postal Union, which ended up putting a standardized a set of rates across all the countries that were part of that union. And by the late 1800s, I mean, you could send a letter internationally for the equivalent of 5 cents in any country, or 2.5 half pence if you were outside the British imperial system. So it certainly did have an impact on that side as well. That'd be something interesting to add to this discussion.
So do we have any other thoughts, comments for Mike?
Yes, yeah,
Morgan.
I
Yeah,
do.
go ahead.
I was wondering how, for example, Denmark is going to stop postal service. How will that increase the price for collectors of Denmark stamps? And if other countries end up doing that, I would think that scarceness would increase price for collectors.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think, I think you're collecting material from the 19th century, early 20th century. That's not going to change, the price point of those particular objects. I mean, there's a fixed supply of those out there. Certainly over time, I would think that the price, you could actually right now you could build a complete collection of Denmark because they're not issuing stamps anymore. I guess that's one positive of it. So I'm not sure what impact that's going to have, but I think it does just put a question mark in my head in terms of, how long is the Postal Service going to be around sending letters in other countries, and what does it mean for the hobby? I mean, you have a lot of collectors who do like those new stamps and collect the new issues. If people don't see regular issuance coming out, are they going to become less enamored than they are already of the hobby?
I guess it's an argument if you're not buying new issues, you can buy the earlier issues.
That's right.
The pennies can go towards the classics instead of the modern issues.
Right.
I would offer this. There's a really good article in the American Philatelist on the end of postage in Denmark. I just got my copy of the AP today. And
Okay.
It's a good multi-page article on that. I guess it's about 5 pages long.
Okay.
Worth the read for all you APS members.
Yeah, definitely to take a look at that, Dick. Thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah.
And I would just like to follow up on that March issue of the AP that was just referred to. For those of you who did not know Mike Wilson before, Mike Wilson was also the same person that wrote about the Black Blot article in the January issue of the AP. And I noticed that this current issue had several letters in response to your article, Mike. Nice job.
Well, thank you, Marianne. And I did breathe a sigh of relief when I saw those letters at the end because I wasn't sure what kind of response that article was going to get. I did have a little put a little opinion in there at the end, but no, it was pretty well received. And again, I was not around as a collector for most of that Black Blot period, but I certainly sympathize with what they were trying to do. But I think they may have just gone a little bit too far in the late 70s and 80s and came across probably a little preachy to collectors at that point in time. So, but that was a fun piece to work on. So, thanks.
So if we don't have any other questions or comments, Mike, I'd like to thank you very much for your support again for Milcopex. And I'd like to say 2 other things. Firstly, that the next presentation is going to be by Rob Hennock, who, again, has been a loyal supporter of Milcopex for many, many years. And he's going to talk about postal history for topical and thematic collectors and exhibitors. And the other thing which I want to mention is that in the very, very near future, hopefully the next few days, the application form to exhibit at Milcopex will be available through the show website, milcopex.org. So for those of you who are actually planning an exhibit, you should be able to go and download the application form, which you will return to Marianne Bowman, and the details of where to send it and how to send it will be on the application and the cover sheet that gives all the details about the show. Marianne, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add before we close for the evening.
No, not really. Just a reminder that this was sponsored by the Milwaukee Philatelic Society and Milcopex.
And I should mention, Marianne and Colin, just quickly, if anybody would like a set of these slides, I'd be happy to send it to you. My email address is mwilson34407 at gmail.com. So.
And for those of you who want to see a repeat of Mike's presentation, Jim Meverden will be putting it onto the Milcopex website, again, hopefully within the next few days. And Marianne, I think this might also be a good point to mention again that Jim recently received an APS award. I don't know if you'd like to say something about that. Jim again, gives tremendous service to Milcopex, handling the website and getting all the talks and everything up on the website. Do you want to say a few words, Marianne?
Jim did receive the Nicholas Carter Award for local service to philately, and primarily because of his work with Milcopex and the website, but he has written articles for and is a member of the Wisconsin Postal History Society. And he's one of those people that sort of works hard on various things. He works behind the scenes. Probably few people know all that he really does for philately and for the Milwaukee Club areas.
it's nice to see him recognized for everything he does, and certainly Milcopex benefits a lot from the work that he does. So, for those of you who know Jim, when you're in touch with him, please, give him congratulations. It's certainly a very prestigious award that he's received. So again, I'll just remind you that our next meeting is March 23rd with Rob Hennick, and Mike's talk will be up on the website shortly, and so also the application form to exhibit at Milcopex. So I wish you all a good night. Thank you again for those of you who are attending, and thank you, Marianne, for being so supportive of Milcopex and these talks.
You're welcome.
Mike, could you repeat your email address again?
Sure, it's mwilson34407 @gmail.com.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so I wish you all good night, and I will close out the meeting in a minute or so. Mike,
Thank you.
thank you very much indeed, and
You're welcome.
have a good evening.
You too.
Okay,
Good night, everyone.
good night.